Hello everyone, my name is Gary O'Mealy, and in this video we are going to continue our discussion on the pituitary gland, move on and talk about the anterior pituitary gland. So we talked a lot in the last video about how the posterior pituitary, in spite of the fact that it secretes two different hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, it's not really an endocrine gland because those hormones were actually synthesized up here in the hypothalamus. That is not the case with the anterior pituitary because it actually is a bona fide endocrine gland. It is responsible for both synthesizing and secreting the 6 hormones that it is responsible for. So 6 different hormones that are being secreted here, that I'm just noticing the text got cut off here, but 6 different hormones that are secreted from the anterior pituitary. These are TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, growth hormone, which I'm sure you've heard of before, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and prolactin, which we mentioned in the previous video on oxytocin. So the release of these hormones is actually controlled by the hypothalamus. So we spent time in a couple of videos ago talking about how the hypothalamus communicates with the anterior pituitary. Well, the reason why the hypothalamus communicates with the anterior pituitary is because the hypothalamus is telling the anterior pituitary which one or 2 of these 6 hormones it needs to secrete at any given time. So the way you can kind of think about this is that the anterior pituitary is not going to secrete any of these hormones unless the hypothalamus gives it the okay on that. So in later videos, we will talk about all these different hormones that are downstream of the anterior pituitary and what they do. But what we need to focus on in this video is understanding which hormones the anterior pituitary secretes and the circumstances under which they are secreted. So here is a full list of all the different pituitary hormones, both from the anterior side and the posterior side. This comes from your textbook. So you can see we already covered in the previous video these 2 down here, the antidiuretic hormone and the oxytocin, which come from the posterior lobe of the pituitary. And then in this video, we're going to talk a little bit more about these 6 hormones up here. Again, growth hormone, prolactin, TSH, ACTH, FSH, and LH. The good news about this, we can go ahead and say, is that you might notice that all of these hormones, even the posterior ones, are in the same class. These are all peptide, protein, and glycoprotein hormones. Therefore, we can basically take it to the bank that they're all going to act very similarly in terms of where is the receptor going to be located. Now, obviously, these hormones will all do different things, but at least we can count on the receptors all being in the same place. Okay, the other thing that you might find intimidating at this point in your early study of the endocrine system, you might be thinking, well, there are so many different hormones. How in the world am I going to keep track of all these? And yes, that is a fair point. Keeping track of all the different hormones can be a little bit of an intimidating task ahead of you. But one piece of advice I will give you right now is to pay attention to the names of the hormones, especially the anterior pituitary and hypothalamic hormones. You are going to find that these hormones very often are literally going to tell you what they're doing. It's literally in their name. So the best example of this is thyroid stimulating hormone. Well, if you take the name at face value, this is a hormone that is going to stimulate the thyroid. And true to the name, if we come over here to the effect that's listed here, thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid to release its hormone. There you go. You don't have to do any memorizing to come up with that, right? So it is important that you spend a good amount of time poring over these hormones, making sure you understand what they're doing. And I'm not saying that memorization here is necessarily a bad thing, but don't spend too much time memorizing. Focus on the name of the hormone. Very often the name of the hormone is telling you directly what that hormone is going to do. Okay, so the idea here behind how the anterior pituitary, you can see these endocrine cells down here, the idea behind how they're going to pick and choose which hormones they secrete starts up here in the hypothalamus. So you have various nuclei up here in the hypothalamus that, in addition to making the oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, these are different nuclei. This is not the paraventricular or supraoptic nuclei, but different nuclei are going to produce other hormones called releasing hormones. These releasing hormones, which are also neurohormones, are secreted into the hypophyseal portal system, and these releasing hormones will be carried directly down here to where these endocrine cells are located in the anterior pituitary. So these endocrine cells contain receptors for those releasing hormones, and when they are stimulated with those hormones, the endocrine cells down here will produce the proper hormone that is appropriate for the releasing hormone that was released. So once stimulated, the anterior pituitary cells will secrete whichever hormone is appropriate, and those hormones will make it into the general circulation. So for example, if we want the anterior pituitary to secrete thyroid-stimulating hormone, it would start up here in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus would produce the hormone TRH, which stands for thyrotropin-releasing hormone. That TRH will stimulate these cells down here to make TSH. The TSH will get into the general circulation, make its way to the thyroid, where the TSH will stimulate the thyroid to make its thyroid hormone, and then that thyroid hormone will get into the general circulation as well. So here is a table that is going to help you learn which releasing hormone matches with which hormone from the anterior pituitary. So not only do we have releasing hormones, but we also have what are called inhibiting hormones too. Think of it this way. When the hypothalamus secretes a releasing hormone, that is the hypothalamus telling the anterior pituitary, let's go, you need to make this hormone here. When the hypothalamus secretes an inhibiting hormone, similarly, or contrastingly, that is what the hypothalamus saying, stop making this hormone. You need to stop doing what you're doing. Stop it right now. Okay, so we've already covered in the previous slide the example of if we want the anterior pituitary to secrete TSH, the hypothalamus needs to be making this hormone right here, TRH. If we instead want the anterior pituitary to make ACTH, we want the hypothalamus to make CRH instead. So this really backs up what I was saying before about pay attention to the name of the hormone. The name of the hormone is going to tell you what that hormone's going to do. TRH, thyrotropin-releasing hormone, that's going to cause the anterior pituitary to release TSH. And then TSH will obviously stimulate the thyroid. CRH, corticotropin-releasing hormone, that is the releasing hormone for adrenocorticotropin releasing corticotropic hormone, GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. Well, these two hormones here, FSH and LH, are sometimes called gonadotropin. So this is the releasing hormone for gonadotropins. We covered very briefly in the previous video that oxytocin is often considered the releasing hormone for prolactin. Dopamine can actually act as an inhibitor of prolactin secretion. Usually we think of dopamine as a neurotransmitter, but it's acting as a hormone in this case. And then for growth hormone, the releasing hormone is called growth hormone releasing hormone, and the inhibiting hormone here is called somatostatin, which we'll also see when we talk about the pancreas in the future. So one of your first tasks here should be making sure you understand and you can remember which releasing hormone triggers the release of which anterior pituitary hormone. Make sure you can match those up. So if we look again at my little study guide here, you can match these things up just like I said. TRH goes with TSH, CRH goes with ACTH, GHRH goes with growth hormone, and GnRH goes with FSH and LH. These are the only two that are secreted as a pair from one releasing hormone. Otherwise, it is a one-to-one proposition. So the idea here is that the hypothalamus will direct the anterior pituitary to secrete one or more of those 6 hormones, depending on its choice of either releasing or inhibiting hormones. So the main thing to keep in mind here is that the hypothalamus is the main decision maker here. The hypothalamus senses things going on in the body. The hypothalamus is one of the most sensitive parts of your body. It will sense the need for various hormones. The hypothalamus will receive that incoming sensory information, make the decision as to which hormone we're going to need in the future, and it will send the correct releasing hormone or inhibiting hormone to the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary should follow instructions very closely and produce the right hormone depending on what it is the hypothalamus wants. So let's cover some quick anterior pituitary targets. We'll cover more of this in future videos. So the TSH that we talked about before will stimulate the thyroid to make its thyroid hormones. We will have a separate video on the thyroid. ACTH will stimulate the adrenal cortex to make cortisol, and we'll have a separate video on the adrenal glands. Luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone will stimulate the gonads to produce sex hormones and new gametes, respectively. So by gametes, we mean sperm in men and ova in females. Prolactin stimulates the mammary glands to produce milk, and growth hormone stimulates systemic cells to grow and divide. So of the things listed here, we are going to have separate videos dedicated to them for all of these except for prolactin. So you can look forward to those in the future. So like I said, we will more thoroughly discuss these anterior pituitary hormones and their targets in future lectures. But for now, the major thing we need to get under our belt is which hormones match with which hypothalamic hormones. And next, before we wrap up this video, we need to not very quickly, but very intimately get familiar with how negative feedback is going to work here. You might be thinking that you feel really good about understanding how negative feedback works, but the thing you need to remember is that your conception of negative feedback up until this point is likely based on something that looks like this. This is again called a simple endocrine reflex. So your conception of how negative feedback in the endocrine system is likely based on this, where you have one endocrine gland that secretes one hormone. Well, what we've just seen in our discussions on the hypothalamus and pituitary is that you don't have one gland and one hormone. You've got at least 2 or 3 glands and at least 2 or 3 hormones. So because things are a lot more involved, things are going to be a little bit more complicated. So we need to get familiar with how the negative feedback is going to work here. So just to kind of give you an illustration of what we're talking about here, we are still going to have a stimulus in what we call a hypothalamic pituitary axis. This is still a homeostasis mechanism. It's just going to have a little bit more of a complicated mechanism and regulation involved. So we're still going to have a stimulus. This is detected by the hypothalamus here, which acts as both a sensor and a control center. The hypothalamus will secrete a releasing hormone here into this portal system. That will stimulate the anterior pituitary to produce what's called a tropic hormone here. So for the sake of argument, let's say that this is TSH. TSH will stimulate the thyroid, for example, to produce thyroid hormone, which then circulates throughout the body to find its different target cells here and produce a response. But because this reflex has 3 different control centers, the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and the thyroid, that way negative feedback is going to work here is not quite so obvious. So let's talk about that. It's very, very, very important that you understand what we're about to talk about here. So if you need to take a break and go get something to drink, go get a snack, go ahead and pause the video and do that, because I cannot stress enough how important what we're about to talk about here is. So make sure you're in the right frame of mind to understand this. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about this. So here you can see the hierarchy of what we've talked about with regard to the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. You have the hypothalamus up here, an arrow connecting it to the anterior pituitary, and then an arrow connecting the anterior pituitary to the various peripheral endocrine glands that it has responsibility over, the thyroid, the adrenal cortex, and the gonads. And then you have some downstream target tissues. Okay, so we are familiar with the idea that the hypothalamus is going to release a releasing hormone into the hypophyseal portal system. That releasing hormone is going to bind to receptors on the cells of the anterior pituitary, and that's going to cause the anterior pituitary to produce one of its tropic hormones. We'll talk about what that word tropic means in the future. But this tropic hormone, whether it's TSH or ACTH or LH, is going to stimulate one of these tissues here. So if this is TSH, it'll be the thyroid. If it's ACTH, it'll be the adrenal cortex. If it's LH, it'll be the gonads. Whatever tropic hormone gets released from the anterior pituitary, that will stimulate one of these glands to produce their hormone. For the thyroid, it's thyroid hormone. For the adrenal cortex, it's cortisol. And for the gonads, it's either testosterone or estrogen. Those hormones, once they are made, will exert their effects on the various target tissues throughout the body, and they'll do whatever those hormones are supposed to do. Okay, but here's the issue. If we keep things going like this, where the hypothalamus is producing its releasing hormone, the anterior pituitary is producing its tropic hormone, and whichever gland here is producing its final hormone in the chain, things are going to get out of control. We are going to end up making way too much of our thyroid hormone or our testosterone, and we're going to start to see symptoms of hypercortisolism or hyperthyroidism or hypergonadism. It is not a good thing to have too much hormone around. You're going to get too strong of an effect throughout the body. It's no different than any other kind of homeostasis reflex. You don't want your body temperature getting too high. You don't want your blood pressure getting too high. The purpose of homeostasis and negative feedback is to make sure that we keep measurable parameters within normal ranges. That's not just for body temperature and blood pressure and blood glucose. That goes for hormone levels as well. We don't want to have too much hormone. We don't want to have too little hormone. So with that being said, we need to understand how the negative feedback is going to work here for the sake of making sure that when we do start making thyroid hormone, we don't make too much of it. Once we've made enough of it, we need to stop producing it. Okay. If you're with me so far, let's continue. Okay, so what we've seen so far is that the hypothalamus makes its releasing hormone. That tells the anterior pituitary to make its tropic hormone. That tropic hormone tells, for example, the thyroid to make thyroid hormone. And that thyroid hormone, its levels start increasing, and it starts exerting its effect through the body. So let's say we get to the point where we have made a sufficient amount of thyroid hormone. We don't need to make any more, we've got enough. So once levels of thyroid hormone or testosterone or whatever example you want to pick, once the levels of that hormone get high enough, that hormone is not just going to bind to its target tissues and produce the predicted response. That hormone, thyroid hormone or testosterone or whatever, will start binding to receptors on the anterior pituitary and binding to receptors on the hypothalamus. This will only happen once levels of these hormones get high enough. But once the hormone feeds back on the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus and binds to those receptors, that will cause these places to stop producing the hormones that got this party all started. Once we have produced enough thyroid hormone, that's going to tell the thyroid that the hypothalamus has made enough TRH and it doesn't need to make any more. That will tell the anterior pituitary we've made enough TSH, you don't need to make any more. So this is really a brilliant setup for getting negative feedback to occur, because this feedback only occurs once we have made a satisfactory amount of thyroid hormone. So once we've made enough, we tell the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, stop making TRH, stop making TSH, and when they stop making their releasing hormone and their tropic hormone, the thyroid will now no longer have the signal telling it to continue making thyroid hormone, so it will stop as well. So kind of the major takeaways from this are, number one, because there are multiple hormones as part of the axis, a more intricate negative feedback system is necessary, so that's kind of the unfortunate thing there. Number two, hormonal signaling is slow. We talked about that in the communication unit. Neuronal signaling is fast, but hormonal signaling is slow. So because hormonal signaling is slow, we need to have a way to stop producing hormone before it gets too excessive, because if you wait until the effects of the hormone show up and then you try to shut it off, it's probably too late. You're going to start seeing symptoms of excess. And finally, feedback control is achieved by shutting off production of the releasing entropic hormones that cause the final hormone, like thyroid hormone, to be secreted in the first place. They are the cause of whichever final hormone got produced, whether it's thyroid hormone or cortisol or estrogen or testosterone. So to better understand this, because even though we went through that, it's hard to understand that the very first time. I totally understand. I had a hard time with this when I learned this as a physiology student for the first time too. So I totally get it if you're a little bit lost. So to help with that, let's go through some examples here. So let's say that our goal here is to produce testosterone because testosterone levels in the body are getting low. So typical homeostasis, something's getting low, we need to bring it back up. So our problem here, our stimulus, is that testosterone levels are low. Well, the reason why testosterone levels are low is because the anterior pituitary is currently not producing luteinizing hormone, which is the hormone that tells the testes to make testosterone. And the reason luteinizing hormone levels are low is because the hypothalamus is currently not producing GnRH, which is the hormone that tells the anterior pituitary to make LH. So just from these three slides here, you can really see the kind of hierarchy of how the hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary what to do and the anterior pituitary tells the testes what to do, right? Okay. So the hypothalamus is going to start things off by sensing the need for more testosterone, and it will respond by producing GnRH. So you can see the up green arrow here to indicate that the hypothalamus is now starting to produce GnRH, and it is sending this GnRH to the cells of the anterior pituitary. Well, the anterior pituitary will respond to that GnRH by starting to produce both LH and FSH. The LH and FSH get into the circulation and they bind to receptors on the cells of the testes, and the testes are going to respond by starting to produce testosterone. So the LH from the anterior pituitary stimulates those testes to start making the hormone that we want, and with that, testosterone levels will start rising, and testosterone will start having its effects on target tissues throughout the body. So, as I said before, if we leave things like this, testosterone production is going to totally go off the rails, and we're going to end up having way too much testosterone, and we'll start to experience hormonal excess, which we do not want. We need to shut things down once we have made a sufficient amount of testosterone. So here's the way this negative feedback is going to work. Once we have made enough testosterone, this testosterone will not just affect its target tissues, but it will feed back, and that testosterone will cause the hypothalamus to greatly reduce its production of GnRH, greatly get the anterior pituitary to greatly reduce its production of LH and FSH. And with that being said, we stop producing any more testosterone, and then now testosterone levels will start to go down again, and then once testosterone levels drop enough, then we'll start this whole process back up again with the hypothalamus starting to produce GnRH again. Okay, so that was a lot of new information, but again, I cannot emphasize enough how important understanding that feedback mechanism is. You are definitely going to get practice with that when you come to lab this week and you do our hormone identification lab. So if you're still struggling with this a little bit, that's okay. Just come to lab and we will get some specific practice on this. Okay, here's a list of vocabulary terms you ought to be aware of. And then for checking your understanding, number one, how is an endocrine reflex involving the hypothalamus and pituitary different compared to a simple endocrine reflex, which only involves one gland and one hormone? And then number two, just as a little bit of practice, chart out the feedback axis for the production of thyroid hormone. We did the specific example of testosterone, but do this for thyroid hormone and make sure you can identify which releasing hormone is necessary, which tropic hormone from the anterior pituitary is necessary, and do your best to chart out how the negative feedback works. Okay, that's going to do it for this video. If you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the comments section, and I will see you next time. So long.